Are you thinking about selling your home in San Francisco, and when you checked on Redfin and Zillow, you didn't quite see the Zestimate that you'd hoped for? Maybe you spoke with a realtor and they managed to break the not so good news to you that you're going to be getting less than you want. Unfortunately, I have similar conversations with potential sellers every week. And if you're like them, you might be wondering, what is your plan B? Should you rent your place now and then sell it later when the market's better? There's actually a few little known facts that I'm going to share with you about the rental market that are unique to San Francisco. And whether or not you're just getting started or you're a seasoned landlord in another state, it's important to understand these 6 pitfalls before you jump in. Pitfall number 1, rent control. So San Francisco's rent control laws are probably among the strongest in the entire country. So the rent control laws are going to limit how much you can increase the rent, and they also set really strict guidelines for evictions. There's a lot of different kinds of rent control in San Francisco, and some properties have like much stricter versions of rent control than others. So if you have a single family home, that's going to have the least amount of rent control. If you have a multi-unit building, that's going to have the strongest amount of rent control. So it's really important that you understand these laws in order to avoid legal issues, which we'll jump into in a bit. Also, keep in mind that if your building is under the strictest form of rent control, that it's also under the strictest form of eviction control, which is what I'm going to talk about next as pitfall number 2. So eviction control actually applies to every property in San Francisco. But just like the one above, there are some properties, the same ones, where it's stricter than other properties. One little known fact that's actually pretty recent is that you can't have a lease in San Francisco shorter than 12 months. So that means if you wanted to rent your home for like, say, a season, because you're like, Ruth, this is not a good time to sell, I'll sell it in the fall, then technically that's not allowed. Another thing that the vast majority of people don't seem to understand is actually at the end of 12 months, the lease is not over. It actually automatically rolls over into a month-to-month lease, and it doesn't end. So the tenant actually has the right to stay in that property as long as they're paying rent. Depending on what kind of property that you have, you might have the option to like raise the rent at the end of 12 months whenever it starts rolling over to what's deemed a reasonable rate, but you can't raise the rent just for the purposes of getting a tenant out. So in certain properties, the rent can only be increased a very, very small amount each year, which is also determined by the city. And many tenants are actually known in these situations to stay in these properties for years or sometimes even decades. I actually did a webinar with an attorney, Scott Freedman, and I'll actually link it. But he actually suggested that in the case that somebody might want to sell in a year, that he would recommend writing the lease that says like, okay, I'm going to rent my property for $4,000 a month. And at the end of 12 months, I'm going to increase that to say $6,000 or $7,000 because I intend to sell the property. And he was saying that he felt that that was a fair way to structure a lease upfront in advance that has this massive increase, but you are setting the intention. So you're not renting it to somebody that's laying down roots and intending to stay long term. They know that going in. So depending on whether or not your tenant ends up giving notice, it actually can be a little bit of a funky time to sell. Like, let's say they give notice in October and then you're like, well, I don't want to sell my house over the holidays. So what do you do then? A lot of people might say like, well, maybe I'll just Airbnb the property. Unfortunately, in San Francisco, surprise, there's Airbnb laws. So you're not allowed to Airbnb your property longer than 60 days unless you have a permit and you're living there. So you could rent out part of your house with a permit for an indefinite amount of time, but you cannot not live in your house and just Airbnb it more than 60 days. So let me put on my mind reader hat, and you're probably thinking, well, I'll just sell it with the tenant in there. Well, that's great, but typically properties actually will sell for 20 or even 30% less if they're tenant occupied. And there's 2 reasons why. One, if you look around on Zillow or Compass, and you see all of the properties that are similar to yours, you're going to notice one thing in common. They're all staged, they're prepped, they're dressed to the nines. And if your property is tenant occupied, it is not going to look great. And I walk through properties with buyers all of the time that are, like being sold early or off market or sometimes not staged. I'd say 95% of the properties are staged, but the buyer's response when they see properties like that is they always think the property's not nice. And often I am telling them, like, just see through this. It is nice, but it just doesn't compare up. So staging really, really does work to help your property sell for a higher value. The other thing is that your tenant may not be super cooperative with showings. So you have to give them 24 hours to access the property, and then they have to respond in order for you to get access. If you can't show the property on time, it could really affect things, because in San Francisco, if something's on the market more than a couple of weeks, then generally it tends to sell for less at a lower price. So it can be really damaging to be affected by like timing or lack of access. Next up, I'm going to talk about lawsuits. But before I jump into that, I'm Ruth Krishnan. I'm the founder of the Krishnan team. And every day we help people just like you who are thinking about selling their homes in San Francisco. Selling is not the right decision for everyone, and we are not going to make it a hard sell for you. We'd be happy to help you think through the plan Bs and weigh your pros and cons and think through different ideas. Feel free to reach out to us in the comments below. Let's jump back in. Lawsuits. I mentioned this before, but San Francisco is a very tenant-friendly city, which makes the risk of getting sued really high, particularly if you're not working with a professional. So please let me know if you want me to introduce you to a great attorney or great rental agent. I should note here, I don't rent homes and I'm not an attorney, so I'm happy to refer you to someone. There's a lot to know about renting. For example, I don't think that you can even have a conversation with a tenant about leaving. I think that's off limits without serving them the right paperwork. And there's copious amounts of free legal services available for tenants. Obviously, these services were set up with the best of intentions to prevent unscrupulous landlords from taking advantage of people. But every year, I hear horror stories about things happening to property owners who get really, honestly, unknowingly caught in the crosshairs of really bad situations. And this can make even the most seasoned landlord look somewhere else to find rental properties. Pitfall number 5, pets. I couldn't believe this stat when I heard it, but apparently more than 80% of people living in San Francisco actually have a pet. I'd be curious if that happened after the pandemic. I think everyone got a pet during the pandemic. But if you'd like to rent your property and not allow pets, it could actually be really difficult. The other thing to note is that even if you decide not to allow pets, you could quickly find yourself getting served up with like an emotional support animal paperwork, which is pretty easy to come by in San Francisco. I'm not saying that that's not a need, but I am saying that people have been known to take advantage of that. Let's talk about pitfall number 6, screening tenants. I hear many people saying to me, Ruth, I just want to rent to a really nice family, my great 3-bedroom, 2-bath home. Well, first off, tenants are not allowed to be screened based on family class, race, color, national origin, sex, familial status, disability, religion, sexual orientation, age, gender identification, gender expression, veterinarian or military status, citizenship, the list goes on. So you can really get yourself into trouble really, really quickly. But be careful with your screening. And also, it's important to know that 80% of renters are actually roommates, which means that if you have a 3-bedroom, 2-bath, your chance of actually having it be rented out to like 3 different people are actually really high. Again, a trained professional has legal ways of screening tenants and helping you understand your goals and get to your goals of what you're trying to achieve. So there's also services that, of course, for a fee, like all of these things add on and take away from your profits, but they would help you also manage the property, changing light bulbs, stoves, whatever, taking those calls. I think my understanding is that's about 6 or 7% a year. but don't quote me on that. Again, happy to refer you to someone. So finally, San Francisco is notorious for coming up with new laws and regulations, in case you haven't noticed. There's like a ton of different safety standards to follow. There's a lot of different paperwork and forms that need to be followed. There are some groups like the San Francisco Apartment Association. So if you do decide to go this alone, you probably should join that, and then you can get access to all kinds of paperwork and webinars and that sort of thing. So I will attach some of the past videos with some of the professionals. I think I've come a long way on YouTube since then. Those were in my COVID days in my living room, but I'll post them there in case you're interested in watching them. If you made it this far and you found this valuable, please smash that subscribe button and feel free to leave me a comment if you have any questions about buying or selling in San Francisco. We'd love to be your real estate agent of choice if you're considering making that smooth move in or out of San Francisco.